Now, Georgia is an interdisciplinary postdoctoral researcher at the university, and she has a background in both marine biology and archaeology. Her research focuses on the interconnections between natural and cultural marine resources, and it addresses the management and conservation of these resources for the sustainable development of the ocean and coastal communities. Now, alongside managing the Cultural Heritage Framework Program, which is an official action of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, Georgia currently works across multiple projects in a variety of very enviable places. So, for example, she is working in the Philippines, the Middle East, and North Africa, and the Southern Pacific. And today, what she is going to be talking about is her work in East Africa, specifically in Mozambique. And if I understand correctly, Georgia, you're going to be giving us information that you really just completed this work in March of this year. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So we finished our second season just at the end of March. So it's really, really hot off the press.
It's very fresh. I can't wait to hear more about it. So Georgia will be talking more today about her work integrating culture and nature, talking about marine protected areas, and working with the local community. So with all of that being said, I suppose I should just turn it over to you, Georgia. So please go right ahead. I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Great. I'll just share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you.
Okie dokie. So yeah, thank you very much for the invite today. I'm really happy to be talking to you about this project. As Matthew said, my background's a little bit mixed. So I'm a maritime archaeologist, but I often say I'm a marine biologist by trade. So that was where the start of my work came from. And this project is really an accumulation of those two things. As Matthew said, we've just finished the second season in March. We're hoping to do a third season. Hopefully we'll get it this year. If not, it'll be next year. But it's an ongoing project which is looking at both natural and cultural heritage of Mozambique Island. So the project's called Integrating Culture and Nature in the Ocean, the Roles and Challenges of Protecting Cultural Heritage in the Natural World. And we've shortened it to Linking Nature and Culture in Mozambique, or LINACU-MOZ, because it was way too much of a mouthful of a project title for anyone to say in the multiple meetings that we were having trying to explain it. So today, I'll give a basic overview of the background, of the context, the challenges that we faced, and the challenges of working in this island, in this quite remote place itself. Then the project rationale, our aims and objectives, our methodologies, some preliminary results, and I stress these are very much preliminary results. We're halfway through. I just actually received a bunch of new data today, so we're really in the middle of properly understanding of the work that we got done, and some of our preliminary lessons learned and the bigger picture. But today, this presentation is really going to be taking us through the field season, you know, what we actually did in the field there, and why we did it. So firstly, it's the very background of this project is that it was based off of a much greater project made by Dr. John Henderson at the University of Edinburgh called Rising from the Depths. Rising from the Depths looked at multiple different countries across the East African coastline. You see here Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and Madagascar. And it was all about sustainable development for coastal communities and using marine cultural heritage to do so. So I did this in multiple different places in multiple different ways. And what we really found was that there is no one size fits all for integrating community and cultural heritage into conservation and protection. There are 27 different projects as part of this overall network. But one that we're particularly following on from is one piloted by Ulster University, which specifically looked into the natural environment as a context for cultural heritage. So this project mapped the geomorphology around Mozambique Island and looked at changing coastlines, primarily due to sea level rise and the Paleo Channel, which you can see marked in the middle of this diagram here, and the relevance of climate change in the past to today and what that means to climate change now, which is actually a huge issue, which we'll see later in this presentation for the local community. And finally, this work is also based partly upon some of the research from my PhD. As you see here, it was looking at integrating the protection of marine cultural heritage into sustainable development in the ocean. It was largely looking into policy, into management methods. It looked into marine spatial planning, marine protected areas, integrated coastal zone management, and general environmental policy, and how culture and nature and the protection of those two things should be much more integrated. So this is Mozambique Island. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this one right in the middle here, within this bay. And it's surrounded by land, and it's connected by a bridge, which you can just see here. So we have Cabeceira Pequeña, which is actually over this side, Cabeceira Grande, Impapa, Lumbo, Musurio, and then the islands we have on the ends here are Goa and Sena, and at the very, very top, you see Setúbal is another island. And the natural marine environment of the island, I'll call it the island of Mozambique, or the Portuguese name is Ilha de Mozambique. So I'm probably going to switch between the island and Ilha in this talk, is made up of sandy beds, seagrasses, mangroves, coral reef, and all of this is relatively patchy around the island and between the smaller islands and the mainland itself. So historically, the island of Mozambique is quite an interesting place. It has quite a colourful past. So Mozambique generally has been part of the Indian Ocean trade network since the 7th century, which gave rise to this vibrant historical record of exchange of knowledge, of skills, of art, and ultimately of settlement. The island itself is particularly well known for colonial settlement and as a major trading port for the East African maritime trade, particularly for Arab merchants between the 10th and the 15th centuries, before Vasco da Gama claimed the island for Portugal in the 15th century. And then it was the capital of Portuguese colonial government from 1507. And the Portuguese traded this island, traded spice, traded slaves, gold for nearly 400 years. And this map is actually quite interesting. It shows one of the two unsuccessful Dutch invasions on the island, trying to take down the Portuguese colonial government, both of which were unsuccessful. There's another map which shows the second one, which is quite interesting as well. So when the slave trade dwindled, so did the island. The capital was moved. There was mass exodus occurring on the island. And so the island's built heritage is somewhat frozen in time, which makes it incredibly interesting. So due to this island's really kind of unique built heritage, a mix of Mozambican, Portuguese, Arab, Indian, the area was inscribed as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in the early 90s. And what we see in this island is really an island of two halves. So these are the pictures that you see now of Stone Town, which has the Centre for Portuguese Government that we talked about. And you see here this blend of Portuguese and Arab and Indian architecture. You also see Makuti Town, which is much more symbolic of traditional African architecture, but what you may also notice is this divide is more than just in its built heritage. Here we have overcrowding, a huge lack of funding. There is a wealth divide that separates these two aspects of these two towns. So while Stone Town retains its Portuguese character, we see Makuti Town actually sat below the road because the stones were used to build the houses. If you see in that second picture at the back, that is the road at the top and then steps coming down, which are actually quite a few meters down. So of course, this area is particularly prone to issues like sea level rise and storms and disease because of lack of sanitation. And the majority of this population that live here use the sea for their livelihood. They're fishers, they're shell collectors. So when we look at the historic and the current marine environment of the island, we see it's made up of all these different features. So we have the historic wrecks, which were largely involved in trade. You see some in the top right of this picture here. And this is mostly from the 17th century onwards. But we see living heritage as well, in the form of traditional uses of the sea. So things like these fish traps you see at the bottom right, traditional boat builders, this man in the middle. We have our shell collectors on the top left, and fishers.
I think it's underwater archaeology.
Fishers in the middle of the left of the picture as well. And all of these people are using natural and cultural resources for their livelihoods. So this is what we refer to when we're discussing marine cultural heritage in this context. So there's a couple of definitions coming up, just that we're all on the same page with this. And really, when we look at marine cultural heritage, it's quite broad. So what we're discussing is all past human action on the coasts, as well as directly on the sea. We see here encompassing tangible remains, such as the shipwrecks, but also our submerged settlements, coastal settlements, ports and harbors, ecologies, geologies, and those intangible components when we look at those cultural practices, artistic and linguistic expression, traditional and historical knowledge. And this is largely what we're looking at integrating as part of this project. And the second definition that we'll just go through here as well is of biocultural heritage diversity, which is a really important part of this project. This is one of the best definitions I can find of it, but there are actually many definitions. This one says that biocultural diversity refers to the interface and relationship between biological and cultural diversity. It has become dominating the discourse, linking different aspects of culture with the use of nature, and for identifying how these links promote and maintain both cultural and biological diversity. So an example of biocultural heritage is traditional knowledge, which is based on knowledge that is passed down through generations, that has become part of heritage, which has become part of an identity of a community. When we add that natural aspect, that's typically to do with fishing practices or various different things, which actually we'll find out a lot more in the following slides. But this type of heritage is hugely threatened all over the world, but particularly in Mozambique Island. And these are just some of the examples. On the left here, that's a cyclone that was happening in March as we were there, where that Cyclone Freddy, you may have heard about it on the news. This Love Heart area here, that's where we were. And the cyclone came all the way around and up here. And this is a huge threat to the island, to the people, and to the biology and ecology of the island. We also have rising sea temperatures. We have coastal erosion, sea level rise, which of course is mostly affecting Makuti town. And you see here, overpopulation, there's a lack of sustainable livelihoods, a lack of sanitation. Treasure hunters is a huge issue in Mozambique Island, because we have all of these 17th to 19th century shipwrecks around the island, which have been really important and integral in Portuguese trade. We have seen one particular treasure hunting company come over the last few decades and take everything from these wrecks. They're completely destroyed by a company called Archaeonautis, who have gone through many different names and many different iterations. And the archaeologists that we worked with on the island have been fighting Archaeonautis for decades. And we see some of that destruction in this project and in some of the following slides. And of course, we also have encroaching commercial fishing, port and bridge development, and a lack of equitable management of these resources. So none of the money, none of the benefits are going towards the coastal communities themselves. They're going usually towards foreign vessels. So here is where the idea, the basis of this project comes. So the aim of the project is to integrate biocultural heritage into the marine protected area plans of Mozambique Island for the equitable management, so the sustainable management of the natural environment, the marine cultural heritage, and the coastal community. So this went through multiple different phases, hopefully 3 phases. We're on phase 2 at the moment. Phase 1 of the methodology we see here. And this we did last September. And this was looking at spending 10 days presenting the project, meeting partners, conducting visual survey of the marine environment, heritage, and talking to the community about future work. So we can see on this map the various sites that we visited in that first stage. So we looked at the marine environment, which are these places in green, these different sites. We looked at the marine underwater heritage, which was these red sites here. And we looked at built heritage, which were these pink places here. And in doing so, we collected various findings that helped us form the kind of targeted objectives for the next season, which are as follows. So this World Heritage Site Plan has been adopted and changed over time, and it is now being extended to include the shipwrecks. However, there is not necessarily a management plan for those shipwrecks. This is one of the main things that we found out. The other thing that we found out is there is pretty much no data regarding the marine ecosystems around the island. So what we discussed at the start, the sandbanks, the coral reef, the seagrass, and the mangroves. There is extensive ongoing work on the local shipwrecks with our partners who are there, but there is limited capacity in the terms of human and financial resources. There is some very limited and gendered socioeconomic data on the local communities of the area. Interestingly, there have been 3 previous plans, marine protected area plans, which aim to look after the natural environment, none of which have included local communities or cultural heritage. And a background to that, if we step back slightly on marine protected area management, is typically what it does is it excludes local people so that the environment can thrive. But in doing so, they become unsustainable in areas like this, where the sea are these communities' livelihoods. So if they can't fish, they can't eat, they can't feed their family. So either they're going to break the rules, or it becomes incredibly unsustainable for the health of the local community. So this is something that we're kind of battling against and trying to find alternative ways to do this. And these methods are called no-take MPAs. So this is the final point. There is one no-take MPA on the south side of the island, and the placement of this MPA turned out to be quite interesting. So the objectives that we decided to take with all of this information, or lack thereof, was ultimately to do a season to collect data on the biocultural health and diversity of the island. So what this means is looking at the environment and looking at the heritage and looking at the intangible heritage. So we looked at mangroves health, coral health, fish health. At the same time, we surveyed the wrecks, reef wrecks, which are when a reef colonizes, a coral reef colonizes on a shipwreck, it becomes this really interesting and central environment for the local community. We surveyed traditional knowledge and community cultural heritage. Secondly, we wanted to work with and train local community monitors in underwater survey techniques to increase the island capacities themselves. And thirdly, we wanted to expand on that socioeconomic data with a survey of the coastal community regarding the marine space, particularly gendered uses of the sea. And when I say that, particularly female uses of the sea, which is the thing that has really largely not been integrated into the data so far, and general perceptions of the local management and how it has been. So this enters us into phase 2, which is what we have just got back from recently at the end of March. So what we were doing is we were integrating biocultural heritage into the MPA plans, and we wanted to survey the natural environment, the marine cultural heritage, and the coastal community. The expected outcomes of this phase. We wanted to create community-centered recommendations for management that were co-created with our partners on the project, and particularly with the community members that worked on this project with us. We wanted to combine scientific and traditional knowledge. So have these 2 different types of knowledge work together to create indicators to monitor and measure the management. So really to see, is it working? And we wanted to provide this strong evidence base to be able to go into our phase 3 of the project, which will really be looking at establishing a solid management plan. So this is our team for this last field season. This is a very interdisciplinary mixed team of local people and people from the University of Edinburgh. We have maritime archaeologists, we have marine ecologists, marine biologists, and anthropologists, all on this team, all working together and all trying to speak the same language. And we have a few of our students here in the picture as well. So this now is that same map that we saw before, but what we were actually looking at this season. So this was really what we focused on. You see these blue patches here are coral reef sites that we surveyed. These are some of the healthiest coral reefs that we could find in our surveys. You also have these little red pins. These are shipwrecks, which I shall talk a little bit about later. We have our green areas, which are our mangroves, which are incredibly important, not just for the biological diversity of the area, but also for the cultural diversity of the area, not just for livelihoods, but as sacred areas, particularly for the coastal communities. And in yellow, you see the coastal communities that we talked to and worked with as part of the project. And as you'll see, they mirror all of the biological and cultural sites that we were looking at. So now I'll go on to briefly talk about some of these preliminary findings after all that work, after all that survey, how we did it, and some of the things that we're starting to be able to put together now. So this is us looking at natural and cultural heritage. So first, the shipwrecks. I know this is a maritime archaeology talk, so we can't get away without talking about some of the wrecks themselves. This is one of the first ones that we dived on. This is a 17th century shipwreck. It's actually a collection of cannons. It's 10 cannons and a ballast stone. This is a byproduct of Archaeonautis, that treasure hunting company that we were talking about earlier, who salvaged anything valuable, so-called, from the site, and have ultimately left these 10 cannons. We have a thought that there could be some hull under the cannons, but we're not entirely sure yet. So we were looking at this, we were surveying this, doing some photogrammetry, and also keenly looking at the coral reef that you can see in some of this picture, and the biome that have developed around this this bit of heritage, this bit of archaeology. And this is particularly important because we're starting to see a pattern with the wrecks, in that the healthiest and most diverse coral and fish populations are around these shipwrecks, or around this heritage, where you see just sandbanks in between. So what we did is for the reef representative, georeference phototransects for benthic coverage, point counts for fish, essentially just looking at the health, looking at the biodiversity. Is it healthy? What's there? What's not there, importantly. This is the second wreck that we looked at. This has got a good story, actually. It was before we got there. It's wreck 29, or the metal wreck. And we had no information on this wreck. We had no idea what it was, its age, and how it got there. It is this quite a big surface area, about 60 by 30 meters. We were conducting photogrammetry on this wreck, which is quite difficult. As you can see, it's very shallow, and there is a huge swell going over the wreck. And for conducting photogrammetry, we really need to be able to have crystal clear still conditions. So it was very challenging, hence why you don't see any of the photogrammetry finished yet on this slide. But the interesting story about this is that we actually were talking to the coastal communities to try and get some information as to what they knew about the wreck. And we found one of the village elders who said that his uncle was called Katafa. The reason his uncle was called Katafa is because he was born on the day that this wreck sank in 1936. So this was all the information we had. Katafa, something along the lines of Katafa, and 1936. After some searching when we got home in the records, we actually found the wreck that it was, which is Kathiawar, and it was sunk in 1937. So this community member gave us the key to being able to find out what this wreck was. Actually coming from Glasgow, coming from Scotland, which is where I'm from, which was exciting. It was a passenger ship. It was sunk because it foundered on the coral banks. There were no casualties. It was very slow. They tried to rescue it for, I think, a week or something like that, until eventually having to leave it there. So that's something that we found out in the last few weeks as to what it was. So we're quite excited to be able to go back and look more into this now. Some more of our survey sites. This is now looking into the coral reef side of things. So Goa exterior, Goa is that island, one of the 3 islands, the one in the middle out in the end. We did a comparative analysis of the reef here and the reef on the wrecks themselves, in Sete Pos, in the Goa exterior, and in Rec 3, where we did a coral and fish survey. And then we get out of the sea and we go into the coastal zone and we looked at mangroves. So in these different areas you can see here, Cabecera Pequeña, Grande, Musuril, Lumbo, and Papa, which are different sites that are all dotted around that coastline, as well as on Mozambique Island itself. We did 4 stations per site, 4 quadrats. We looked at tree abundance, height, width, sapling growth, which is all looking at essentially how healthy these mangroves are, and also how used they are by the local community and where they're used. Let's see, the 2 end bits, invertebrate counts and anthropogenic interference. Invertebrate counts are looking at the mangrove snails, essentially, that our local people collect them, eat them, sell them. And anthropogenic interference, that's look at what's being cut, where is it being cut, and why. And this is particularly important when we're talking to boat builders, because boat builders are using the mangroves and specific mangroves for building of their traditional vessels. So overall, this is the kind of the extent of the data that we managed to collect. Rec photogrammetry of 3 different sites. We looked at the percentage benthic coverage on and off the wrecks with fish, with reef, and we looked at species lists, and we looked at comparative analysis of the stability of the reef itself in relation to the wreck sites, and stability monitoring. So ultimately, what we're looking at here is how healthy is this reef, is this ecosystem on the wrecks and off the wrecks, and how are the community using it? So that final part of the puzzle is our socio-cultural heritage aspect. This is now talking to people that use these areas every single day. And yeah, boy, did we talk to the people. We did a huge amount of workshops, a huge amount of interviews, learned a huge amount working with the local communities in these areas. So one of these aspects was mapping gendered uses, as I mentioned before, of the marine environment. So this is largely looking at areas of work, so where women are working compared to where men are working, areas of worship and sacred areas, so what's important to these different groups of people, areas of taboo, so what has some negative associations, community stories, oral histories, and traditional knowledge of natural and cultural heritage. So we had 9 women in the women's workshops, which are a mix of shell collectors and, very interestingly, breath-holding spear fishers, which were an incredibly interesting group of women. And in the men's workshop, we had 16, primarily fishers and boat builders. So what we actually found, and again, this is very preliminary observations within these workshops, we found, we think, 2 new potential wreck sites, which is something that we're quite excited about. Hopefully we'll be able to look into in the next season. We documented some incredibly important areas for protection for the local community that haven't so far been included within any sort of management plan. So these are sacred areas, areas that are particularly important for community identity. We documented some oral histories, including that of the wrecks that we talked about before, and looking at the use of marine resources and sea spaces. And we found that there are huge differences, as expected, between male and female uses of the sea, and generationally between where different generations are going and using the sea as well. What we were finding with the female spearfishers is that this group of spearfishers have adapted this behavior because of subsistence, because of the need to. However, they learnt it from immigration of different women from different islands, and they formed a spearfishing group. And it's really quite interesting how they do it and where they go to do it. Some of the issues associated with this And one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from the last season that we found was that the no-take MPA, the no-take protection zone that's currently in place, directly affects women's livelihoods. In fact, it's only over where women are fishing. So there are multiple reasons why this is. It's likely because women typically aren't included within this type of data collection. So hopefully this is something that we're able to very quickly change and adapt these MPA plans for the women, because either, I mean, when talking to them, either they are being forced away to further away where they're not going to make as much money, they're not going to be able to feed their family, or they're using this area anyway, but illegally, and then tend to have to bribe or pay huge fees to local regulators. And then, as well as our workshops, we conducted interviews. So this is where we went around all of those different survey sites that we showed at the beginning, and talked to all of the different people that we could, as wide a variety of people that we could, to understand uses of the sea. And we conducted almost 60 interviews in the end. So we have a huge amount of data that we're sifting through as we speak. The primary themes that we were looking at are, of course, connections to the sea and how these are changing. So changing generationally, changing between different genders. We're looking at current management, so community-based management versus government implemented management. Of course, sacred areas, traditions, taboos, and again, perceptions of traditional knowledge regarding those particular themes that we were looking at in this whole season, which are those coral reefs, the mangroves, and the shipwrecks themselves. So we went to 5 different sites. We had about 34 women and 24 men, with a nice big age range of 20 to 77. And I think it was the 77-year-old that was telling him about his uncle Katafa, who was born on the day that wreck, the metal wreck, sunk. So again, we have some preliminary observations of this last season. It's very clear that the community are really aware of the environmental issues like climate change and coastal erosion and overfishing. In fact, these topics have been broached by various different NGOs for the last decade. One of the issues that we do see is that they're told that a method of fishing, for example, that they're using is unsustainable. But what they don't have is an alternative method. What they're not given, what they're not co-creating is another method of livelihood. We're seeing there's a generational knowledge of changes to the marine environment. There's significant traditional knowledge regarding the health, the biodiversity of the reefs, the mangroves, the shipwrecks. And community identity is ultimately linked to all of these things. So as they disappear, so are community traditions and cultures. And one example of this is one of the MPAs, not the no-take one, but one of the heavily managed MPAs in the area is over a mangrove area. This is a sacred area which has been managed for generations and generations of local people that have specific ceremonies that they use in this area for health, for different things, and they're not able to do this anymore. And as a result, are losing a huge amount of their identity and connection with the natural environment and the mangroves in this area. And that's something that we documented in the interviews. Again, we see these seasonal no-take areas and one full no-take area, which is the one that's over the women, and the community understanding why, but not having other livelihoods to practice. And I think this is a good quote, which kind of really exemplifies what we're talking about here, where one of the fishermen from one of the communities that we were talking to said, the government regulations are reasonable, but we often break the rules because we do not have an alternative. We are hungry. So now we're looking at, and this is our job now, combining scientific and traditional knowledge. So how can heritage help? You know, how can maritime archaeology help? How can integrating all of this into the MPA plans, management plans, actually help this community? So we're looking at these areas, the shipwrecks, the reefs, the mangroves, the intangible heritage, and combining all of this knowledge that we have from our surveys and that we have worked together and collected from the community. We've seen that the shipwrecks are important for community oral histories. No, not just for history, not just for filling in the blanks, but for people. They're important for fishing because these are areas of high biodiversity. So the fishermen are using them. They're important for navigation because the fishermen use them for navigation as biodiversity hotspots. Interestingly, the community are using the shipwrecks to monitor sea level rise because they say that the shipwrecks get further and further away every year. We also see reef and wreck structural stability and fishing and the connections between these two different things. I think I might talk about this slightly later, but ultimately what this means is that, and one of our preliminary findings that we're working towards is understanding that these shipwrecks are acting as biodiversity hotspots, and the reefs and the fish structures are using these as islands and hopping in between them. So this is incredibly important for the fishermen, the protection of the wrecks, and the protection of the environment. And it's something that's not currently managed within any sort of management plan. So we don't know what's happening ultimately. But it's something that's incredibly important, especially as we see these cyclones coming in every year, which cause waves which destroy the coral reef. And the only thing that's protecting them are these wreck structures. We also see this generational knowledge on coastal erosion, providing us with really valuable data on changing coastlines. We're documenting the traditional ceremonies and the stories which teach new generations about why the environment is changing and disappearing and what people can do to alter that. But one of the main findings, again, as I said earlier, the most important findings, I think, from this season is that communities around Ila are ultimately disadvantaged by some of these current management practices. And when I say this, I particularly mean the women that are using these areas, which are being excluded from their fishing areas. So these are just some of the bigger lessons that we can take into environmental management generally. So around the island of Mozambique, but generally globally, we are really only beginning to understand these complex connections between biocultural heritage, maritime archaeology, marine biology, coastal community heritage. These things are ultimately incredibly interlinked, and we don't really fully understand them anywhere. But the most important thing is there is no one size fits all. Every different area, every different method of conservation needs a specific way tailored to that community, which is something that we haven't seen so far. When we see these one size fits all kind of typically Western management methodologies, we're trying to evolve this into a bottom up way rather than from the top down. We see that environmental indicators don't provide a clear picture of sustainable environment management. And when I say that, I mean they're not including community indicators, health indicators, people indicators. And of course, we have to take into account the community interactions with the natural environment, the cultural significance of heritage, traditional knowledge. All of these aspects and all of these different small end communities need to be taken into account into management. And these are just some of the other projects that we're doing at Edinburgh, which are looking into this. So Matthew mentioned at the start, I'm working in the Philippines, which is fantastic. What we're doing here is reintegrating intangible heritage into environmental management to increase advocacy within indigenous populations. So in the Philippines, ancestral waters are getting taken away from the ancestral descendants for commercial purposes. What we're trying to do is reintegrate indigenous peoples into those environments through heritage protection, heritage awareness there's a huge amount of shipwrecks there, and how these can be used for different livelihoods. And we're also working in the Middle East and North Africa with different areas where I mean, Matthew mentioned all of these different projects that we're on working on these kind of projects. But ultimately, as I said at the start, this is all about individual, not one size fits all, bottom up methodology for understanding heritage as a dynamic network rather than as an individual piece of history. So I'll finish with these two quotes that we got from our interviews, which again, I think really sum up this project quite nicely. The first one is, other than the sea, there are no other means of livelihood. That's from a fisherman in one of our communities. And the other one is from a woman who collects shells, which is, my children and I live in the ocean. We are the sea. So thank you very much.
Georgia, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. And I mean, there's so many interesting things that have come out of just your project, as well as just the results that you've talked about today. And what I find particularly exciting about this kind of work is that it's a nice reminder that when we're thinking about maritime archaeology, we should think about more than just the shipwrecks on the floor of the sea and what they might represent and what we can learn about the past. I think what's wonderful about this work is how much it can tell us how these examples of heritage are really integrated into the everyday lives of people around the world. And as you said, they have this very dynamic relationship there. And it's really great to see the work you're doing. So as always, we can open all of this up now to questions from the audience. As we've done in the past, we generally try to ask you all to type messages into the chat so that we can be sure that we can see your messages. Then myself or Zeynep or Tuba, we will try and relay them to Georgia, unless she can see the messages in the chat as well. Now, to get things started, I've actually got, I suppose, one big question for Georgia. I mean, it seems like you've identified all this incredibly dynamic, rich environment. Let's say, for argument's sake, somehow someone came to you from the government and said, we're going to help you do whatever you feel is necessary to solve this problem, to establish something that would fit out there. I mean, from your perspective, what is, in a way, an ideal solution out there to deal with all these different threats and dynamics?
So I think, I mean, as you say, that's the big question. That's hopefully what the next phase of this project is going to be. I think that it's going to involve multiple different aspects, and different aspects that haven't necessarily been integrated into this type of management before. So something that I mentioned earlier was equitable management. So this is really looking at how local people can survive and thrive from heritage and from the natural environment. The ways in which that can be done need to be co-created with the community themselves. I think that's something that none of us can come and say, this is how you do it, this is the way in which it needs to be implemented. It needs to involve a large-scale project that's led by the community, that is prioritized by what the community needs and value. So there isn't really an answer to that question without going and physically doing that. But the way I can answer it is what it shouldn't be. And certainly what it shouldn't be is a way in which environmental management is typically dealt with these issues, which is placing this no-take marine protected area over the island, which is some of the plans that they're thinking of. They have kind of A, B, and C MPA plans. One of them is creating the whole island to be no-take. We actually talked to those MPA managers while we were there about this. And they're very environmental focused. They want to increase the fish stocks. They want to increase the health of the coral reef, the diversity of the coral reef. Science shows if you take away people, you increase the fish stocks and you increase the biodiversity of the coral reef. And it's very easy to forget the community as part of this. But what we're starting to see now with new science is that that doesn't work. The community will do it anyway, or the community will move away, or the community won't survive. You know, it's impossible to do that sustainably and equitably. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I know some of the ways how not to do it, but not yet how to do it.
Yeah, it is. It's a big, complex question. It's a very tricky thing. Now, we've got a couple of comments coming up in the chat already. One is actually from Jeffrey Summers, who prior to this was actually in Ankara, but now he's with his family in Mauritius. And he simply wants to ask directly rather than typing out his question. So Jeffrey, go for it.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
A little.
Thank you very much for that really excellent lecture. It covered so much ground. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm probably much closer to the Mozambique island than anybody else who's in this meeting at the moment. I have a couple of comments and a couple of questions. My first comment generally is that everything you've been saying, I would say, applies to almost all of the Western Indian Ocean. You hear exactly the same sorts of problems here in Mauritius, in Madagascar, and all down the East African coast. So it's a very, very general problem. Although, of course, each nation state has its own different approaches to it and the relationship between government and communities and so forth and so on. So I think that it's a huge international problem. There were two things that you didn't mention, which I would be pleased to hear you comment on. One is the role of tourism in sustainable development, which of course is crucial here and in other places. And the other crucial thing here in terms of fish stocks and no-take zones and so on is the role of international commercial fishing. The Indonesian and Chinese and French and Spanish boats which have come in and taken almost everything out of the Indian Ocean and the Mozambique Channel and so forth. And looking at fish stocks of biodiversity along the narrow coastal strip where you have these wonderful coral reefs, which we have here and so on, is one thing. But without doing something internationally about the bigger picture, I'm not sure that anything will be sustainable in the long run. So those two comments, and then a question, and this is a question which has come from students here in the little bit of teaching that we're doing on things like traditional vernacular architecture around the Indian Ocean. How do I answer my students who say, why should we preserve any of this built colonial heritage, any of these buildings and structures, when what they represent is one of the most awful and ghastly aspects of human history, which is the slave trade? I'd be very pleased to know what your answer to that is.
Thank you for your questions. I think I'm glad actually that you mentioned both tourism and commercial fishing. So I'll talk about those first. Tourism is a very interesting and as I'm sure you're aware, a complex topic within this kind of sustainable development livelihoods discussion in the Western Indian Ocean. And of course, very different between the Mauritius and Mozambique. I think in different areas, tourism is incredibly important. I think in Mauritius is one of the most important. In Mozambique Island, it's unfortunately tourism is almost non-existent. The reason for this largely is regular cyclones and terrorism. And pre-COVID there was more. Post-COVID, we've been talking to the tourism board for the last few years in Mozambique, and they've had a real struggle with having any tourists come back whatsoever. So in Mozambique Island, it's something that we can develop slowly, but it's something that's actually very, very difficult to engage with in this area, unfortunately. My other comment though on tourism is to do with tourism and heritage, and particularly marine heritage. And it's something that I find quite difficult to contend with, because when we look at the literature, especially the literature in environmental management, marine cultural heritage, marine archaeology, its benefit is often only limited, only minimized to tourism. This being because we have to find some sort of valuation for heritage as part of an environmental management framework. That's unfortunately just what it's based on. And if we're looking at money only, we actually see tourism to be marine cultural heritage tourism to be a really, really small part of environmental management frameworks. So it actually limits what the huge benefits of marine cultural heritage are. We don't see what those huge benefits are when we simply limit it to tourism. I'm not saying that's what your question was saying at all. It's just something that I always like to note when I'm talking about tourism, is that marine cultural heritage isn't only tourism. And as part of that, I really like to focus on the other aspects, because I worry about this nominal representation of cultural heritage as tourism in the environmental management world. Secondly, on your commercial fishing comment, that's, yeah, of course, huge issue, as you said. And in Mozambique, a huge issue. We see huge commercial fishing fleets coming in, and it's one of the major problems that we see with unsustainable fishing in the area. This is something that we can't tackle as much when we're looking at marine protected areas. This is more to do with marine spatial planning, which is looking at this management of industry. So this is hopefully a future aspect of the project. So looking at MPA now, which is trying to understand the conservation ultimately of the livelihoods of the biology and of the heritage. Then we're hoping to look into MSP in the future, which is then going to be looking at the port development, the commercial fishing, bridge development, all of these kind of big industry issues, which are, as you say, of course, a fundamental issue within the management of these environments. So yeah, incredibly important, and something that's very difficult to manage just as a research institute, as well as I'm sure you're aware. And finally, your final comment there was, why preserve colonial structures? Why bother? And again, a really important comment, and I will extend that as well to why preserve the shipwrecks. These are Portuguese colonial structures too, ultimately. Why preserve any of these? And this is all kind of mixed up with value, which is something that we're trying to work out how to represent within this project. And ultimately how we're doing it, how I answer that question, is, of course, you have the base answer, which is important to document history, no matter what, for understanding of history, for understanding that we don't recommit our mistakes. We know that answer. But looking at its relevance today, once we have documented that history, I like to turn it over to the people that live there. Is it important? Is it an integral aspect of the identity of the island, of the people? Is it something that they want to keep or not? And this isn't necessarily the right answer, but it is the answer that I give. I don't necessarily think it is important to preserve if it is not relevant to the local people, the local values, local communities. And I think a good example of this is the statues of colonial slave traders. You had this issue in Britain, actually you had it in Mozambique as well. People took down the statues and have replaced them with different things. That's not necessarily erasing history, it's just choosing to celebrate different aspects of it. So my answer is, as long as it is recorded, understood, talked about, then preservation, or the value behind preservation, needs to go towards what is valuable to local people. Not necessarily the right answer, but that's my personal opinion.
Thank you. Two very brief comments, and then I'll switch myself off. The first is, yes, tourism is very important to Mauritius, and it's probably one of the biggest single contributors to the destruction of the coastal marine environment, through hotel building, but also through all the activities that the hotels do, water skiing, windsurfing, so forth and so on. So tourism brings in a lot of money, but on purely environmental terms, you might be very much better off in Mozambique Island without it. with regard to built heritage, well, certainly in Mauritius, most of the government would like to erase all vestiges of the built vestiges of the British and French colonial periods. That's what the local people, there's either no interest or it's seen as symbols of oppression. So I just throw that out as a comment. Of course, Mauritius is very different because we don't have an indigenous population. So quite the same case. Anyway, thank you very much for your excellent talk.
No, thank you. And I'll just as well, actually is relevant just to add, with the tourism, really, really good point. Our project in the Philippines is actually looking at, I'm sure you know, ecotourism, which is often a greenwashed version of normal tourism. We are looking towards creating equitable tourism of local shipwrecks, because currently the local dive schools in the Philippines are pushing local people out of fishing from these shipwrecks for the diving industry. It's actually creating a huge amount of money, and it's taking away indigenous populations who are actively using these wrecks. So we're starting to look towards working with them to create equitable tourism where local people are more engaged, and actually finding some legislation which can stop them being pushed out of these areas which they're currently getting pushed out of by dive schools. That's one small example, but yeah, again, as you say, not just a Western Indian Ocean issue, a global issue.
Okay. All right, Jeffrey, thank you for that. Those are good questions, and they're actually very similar to ones I had. And the issue of the colonial and protecting that heritage is also similar to a question that Sarah Rich brought up within one of her questions regarding, you know, I mean, my feeling is that, Georgia, you're not consciously taking a colonial perspective. In fact, I think you're very much trying to take a post-colonial perspective because you're working very closely with the local community. And I think the approach you're taking, in which you are, say, documenting the heritage and then letting the local community decide what to do with it. My impression too is that this is a post-colonial perspective. But Sarah, please, you know, jump in if you feel I'm kind of skipping over that first question that you put into the chat. So I'm going to move on to the second one. Sarah's actually asking also about, regarding your background in biology and archaeology, do you think within this project, or more generally, there's this kind of odd inertia in which people are trying to maintain this strange division between nature and human culture? Because fundamentally, we're just animals too. I mean, that's really the point she's making. So how do you feel, can we really be divorced from these habitats? What do you think about that?
So I'm not sure, is the question more about within the project or generally? I'm just finding it now. You know, can't be divorced from their habitats any more than any other animal. Yeah, I mean, in a way, and do jump in if I'm not quite understanding the question, but I do think that we're almost going further back to basics, to saying nature and culture are consistently evolved together. You don't have now, you don't have nature without culture and culture without nature. You have cultural landscapes. People's culture is determined by the environment that they're in. The environment now is completely determined by the cultural approaches to farming, or, you know, to whatever practices that we have with the environment. They are logically one and the same. The reason we're having to reintegrate, as we say, is that environmental management practices for the last 6 decades has ultimately looked to separate those two aspects in management, has looked to protect cultural heritage, has looked to protect natural environment, and these two different fields didn't talk to each other in environmental management. That's why you have all these different ways of managing the marine environment, like MPAs and MSP. Only in the last 5 to 10 years have they included cultural heritage within that type of management. Otherwise, cultural heritage has been in the marine environment at least, but this actually does terrestrially, this is relevant as well, where we see this protection in legislation. In the UK, salvage legislation, we don't see these aspects of marine protected areas for the historic environment. So that's why this kind of last decade of literature points towards these two things need to be connected. These two things need to be working together, and these two things need to talk to each other, because that's what people who live and breathe these environments, like the local community of Mozambique, live every day and live off. So it doesn't work for them to disciplinize these categories. Is that answering the question? Is that have I?
There she is.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, kind of, I guess. I mean, I think that what I'm asking about is a little bit more exhaustive than just like environmental management of the last 6 centuries. I mean, I think we're talking about, a conceptual divide between whatever nature is supposed to mean and, the behavior and customs of one animal that exists, on Earth as being fundamentally separate from that, from that matrix of whatever it is that we mean when we say nature. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, this is a much bigger problem than a much bigger issue, I think, than again, like your assessment of this just being like in the last 6 decades or something. It's probably closer to 6 centuries or even longer than that. And so, yeah, my question was really like, if you think that this like shift in terminology of just like nature culture or biocultural heritage actually addresses the this incredibly dangerous divide that many people have argued is actually the cause of climate change to begin with, and the cause of the Anthropocene to begin with. And so it seems I don't know, it seems to me like it's sort of like putting a band-aid on a like a fracture, but I was just curious as to what your thoughts were, coming from 2 different disciplinary approaches, and if you've even read much of the theoretical literature on on this issue.
Yeah, so I think as I understand, you're talking more about the theoretical, as you say, components of nature and separating humans and all of these aspects. And yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the theoretical and almost philosophical components of what we're talking about here, it's centuries this problem has been, and I think it's really relevant that you're saying this is one of the fundamental issues of climate change, because we see ourselves as separate, and then we separate all of these aspects into different categories such as nature and culture and all of these things that we're talking about. But with a project like this, we have not theoretical problems, not philosophical problems. We have a community that cannot fish because they're taken out from the MPA because environmental management has said that humans are separate. So I think that this theoretical background is incredibly important and needs to be part of the wider discussion of, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. But within a project like this, which is very much small scale, bottom up, management-based protection and conservation, I personally believe reintegrating these phrases like biocultural heritage is a really, really useful way to talk to MPA managers who work on the island, who do not necessarily have a large-scale knowledge of the theoretical and critical backgrounds of environmental philosophy. Like, we need to speak in this language and use useful terms like biocultural heritage to be able to get across the point that we're both ultimately arguing, which is that nature and culture is one, humans are part of the environment, and we shouldn't be separating ourselves as the disciplines have for a very long time.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the point, and I'm sure that like we are probably on the same page or of the same mind on this issue. But I mean, I would argue that that separating like the theoretical aspect from the policy aspect is also sort of erroneous, because it's the theoretical aspect that sort of underpins the policy actions. But yeah, I mean in that case, why not just say heritage instead of trying to combine things that were previously separated? Why not just say heritage? But I do want to get back to one quick point about that that Matthew glossed over in my first question on post-colonialism, And I mean, for the most part, you know, I mean, I agree with you, you know, but I mean, I would kind of push back a little bit and just in that second half of the question, you know, because I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the question, but I noticed that you started the sort of historical aspect of your presentation with the moment of Portuguese mapping of these islands, the moment of colonization. And that seems, I guess, just to kind of, it made me kind of perk up and think about how this project might change if you were to adopt a more post-colonial approach. And so I was wondering if, you know, as you are extracting traditional knowledge from locals, do they receive any payment in return? Are they being empowered to take charge over their own heritage? So if you could maybe just give a brief comment on that. And I don't want to dominate the conversation at all or like make you feel like you're, you know, like I think this is a great project.
No, don't worry. These are really good and important questions. I wrote down a couple of points to talk about. Firstly, why not just say heritage? Really, really important point here, actually. And that actually, my knowledge of that is from being from two separate disciplines, and talking to people about this every day, and I work across 7 projects doing exactly this. And when you just say heritage, why not just say environment? Why not just say marine? You know, why? And we get mixed up in this terminology. And one of the reasons I am adopting more biocultural heritage, actually, it's to perk everyone's ears up in all the different disciplines. Because if you just say heritage, you're isolating a whole bunch of scientists who will not listen to you. Like, this is the story of my career. It's trying to actually work with integrated science and work with integrated theory to try and get everyone to perk their ears up and care and work within these kind of projects. So that's the personal reason within just my background why I don't just use heritage. When we're looking at post-colonial narratives on Mozambique Island, yeah, really good point, with starting with the colonial history of the Portuguese on this island. The primary reason I did that is because that's the built heritage that we're working with within this presentation. But you're right, of course, there is a huge history behind that, and it's actually being led by some of the students in the area who are looking at Mozambican trade before colonial trade. But this is new. This is someone's PhD. This is something that hasn't really been done yet. And it's a really, really important part of all of the work going on this island. And part of that is documenting these oral histories. So talking to the community, documenting their histories, what they find important, their knowledge, which brings us on to payment, a really contentious and difficult issue, ethical issue to deal with when you're working with local communities and when you're trying to co-create with local communities. What we did was subsidize any time that we took from them that they would have been fishing with salary. So we weren't necessarily paying for information, but we were subsidizing the time that we were taking from them, if that was them coming to us or if that was us taking time out of their day as best as we could. So that was the method that we took from that. But ultimately as well, we wanted to make it that community have a stake in this project. You know, it's not just paying them for information and then using it. It's about actually continuing to go back and work together and try and understand what's important, and creating a economy out of that can sometimes provide some ethical issues with kind of not having a stake, for example, in it, if that makes sense. So we had to think about all of these things, and we tried to do it in a way that was as fair and ethical as possible in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, payment doesn't necessarily just have to come down to money, right? Like
yeah, absolutely,
cash or something.
Well, yeah, that's the other, yeah. Yeah, so of course, to add to that, we took a lot of the students, there's an aspect of community monitors. This isn't necessarily answering your question, but it made me think of that, which we were taking in training and working with as part of the project as well, which is also trying to aid in that sustainability aspect of the project, right? What happens when we go away and it's all finished? So we're trying to establish this sense of sustainability of once we're gone or once funding is gone, what happens after that?
So I think that, Sarah, did that cover your questions?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Georgia, for those great answers.
Okay, great. Good to know. And indeed, I mean, these are all, as Georgia said, and as Sarah has been emphasizing, these are all difficult, big questions that, you know, you guys are dealing with on a daily, monthly basis. So it's really good to hear this conversation and to bring all this up. I have a slightly different issue related to the treasure hunting. Question about that, because I'm vaguely familiar with some of the efforts they've been doing protecting maritime cultural heritage in South Africa and the problems they've run into. And one issue that they encountered was that many of the groups doing the treasure hunting along the coast of South Africa simply had very close ties to the government itself.
Yeah.
And so are you encountering the same thing in Mozambique, or are they just, I mean, what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what was happening in Mozambique. At the same time that the Mozambicans signed for the World Heritage status, it also signed a permit for Archaeonautics to salvage all of the shipwrecks.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, it's the same issue. And the people there at Kyrene, Ricardo and Yolanda Duarte, who are the maritime archaeologists there, have worked extensively their careers working against this salvage and this treasure hunting in the island, but it's had a huge and horrible effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the problems that they encountered in South Africa was that, you know, the treasure hunters may be showing up and they might be looting, say, you know, Portuguese, Dutch wrecks. But from the point of view of the local community, this is the issue what Jeffrey brought up. You know, these are the colonial wrecks. Why should they protect them? Moreover, it's helping out the local economy. So everyone is in a way benefiting. So it becomes a really complex question. Yeah.
And again, it's so different depending on what's happening and who it's being done by, right? Is it an international salvaging company or is it local people? You see the issue, I think we might have been talking about it recently in Indonesia, where Japan are now suing a county in Indonesia because their local community salvaged a bunch of the World War II wrecks there and used them for housing, used them for living in. And this is getting a huge backlash from the community saying this is absolutely outrageous and unethical, that they're getting sued for doing this because that's not Japanese heritage necessarily when this was heritage that was warships on the Indonesian coastline. So it's again very ethical and tricky issue which there is no one right answer for, but is relevant to what you're saying. And there's other aspects that can work in different ways. I mean, it's not treasure hunting, but in the Philippines we see commercial fishing, which is fishing in ancestral waters now. And they're actually paying the indigenous community to fish in their waters. The government are saying that this isn't allowed. The indigenous population is saying it is because it's our waters and we're getting a huge amount of money for these commercial fishing fleets to fish here, even though it's destroying the natural environment. In fact, some of them are employing the indigenous people to work with them to do it. So again, really complex and difficult ethical questions that, you know, there is no one right answer for.
Yeah. This is, well, I think as everyone can tell, we could probably keep going on and on and on about these problems and these ethical, philosophical, and very practical issues for a very long time. But before we do that, are there any other questions from other people? No one else? Okay, then. Well, at that point then, unless we're going to take up the rest of everyone's day, I think it's best to actually let Georgia go and relax from all of this peppering. So again, Georgia, thank you very much for your talk, for the information, for this very interesting project, as well as all your efforts. And please keep us updated as this project proceeds. I really want to see what comes up from it in the future. And so thank you, all of you, for attending this evening or this afternoon or this morning, depending upon where you are. One brief announcement. We are going to have another one of these lectures coming up in October. We have already learned of confirmation from an individual, I can't remember his last name right now, so I won't break it. But he's going to be talking about the upcoming research on the Cape Caledonia shipwreck, the late Bronze Age site off the southern coastline of Turkey. So that's coming up in October, so please be looking out for our announcements. That's coming up soon. Otherwise, thank you all again, and I really appreciate it, and everybody take care. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye-bye. Good night.